be seated, and we will next invite our guests. As indicated on the program for this first forum, we will next introduce the personalities that accompany us this morning. The question has to do with well-being. Where is well-being heading? And that is one of the questions that will be responded during this first panel. After the opening ceremony we just witnessed, during which we heard about comments, interesting data, important facts that are always relevant when trying to understand the relationship between happiness of the families or the individuals and the well-being standards that people have. Therefore, it's interesting to understand from the guest's perspective, the panelist's perspective, where well-being is heading, where we are going with this concept. I would like to introduce the presenters. The first one, Mr. John Halliwell from the British Columbia University in Vancouver. He will be talking about happiness, and he is the editor-in-chief of the World Report on Happiness. Next, we have Mr. Make Wiking. He is a Danish administrator. He's the director of the Research Institute of Happiness in Denmark. We will also hear from Rodolfo de la Torre in Mexico. He's coordinator of the United Nations Development Program. We also have Gonzalo Hernandez Licona from Mexico. He is the executive secretary of the Coneval, the National Evaluation Council. And then we will have Erik Wittrup from Denmark, representative of UN Habitat in Mexico. I would like to extend my appreciation to the panelists this morning during their presentation at the International Forum of Wellbeing and Development Policy, organized by the Undersecretary of the Development Ministry by Mr. David González Áviles. Thank you, David, for this invitation. We will next give the word to the first speaker, Mr. John Halliwell. Please welcome John Halliwell, whose resume I briefly read. He's an expert when it comes to well-being as well as the social capital and economy. He is the director of the Advanced Research Center in Canada, and he's co-editor of the 2013 Happiness Report. Welcome, Mr. John Halliwell.
Buenos dias. Are you happy? I would like to run a survey, please. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you could sing too, and naturally in Spanish, that would be even better. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, and you really want to show it, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. You are such a large and friendly audience. I was trying to see if you were going to go for the world record of the most noise made when that song is sung, and your nearest competitors are a similarly sized crowd in Rome and in Rio. So you're in very good company. Thank you. The survey question now is, do you feel happier than you did 2 minutes ago? Typically people say yes, and it's certainly not because I sing, it's because we sang and we did something together. That turns out to be a fundamental producer of happiness. A second reason for asking that question was to introduce different ways of measuring subjective well-being and to link them together. When I asked you, are you happy now, you knew just what I meant and you knew how to answer. I was asking about happiness as an emotion or a feeling. And there are a range of such emotions, positive and negative, that are asked in surveys. There are also a range of negative emotions, measures of negative affect, which are asked in surveys. What I'm going to be talking mainly about are not the affect measures, either positive or negative, but what are called life evaluations. And a life evaluation is the answer to a question, just like Aristotle said 2 millennia ago, you should ask people in a reflective mood to look at their life as a whole and to rate it. And he listed a whole lot of things that he thought. Is that better? He listed, it sounds better to me too. He listed a whole lot of things that he thought were important, and he said that is only theory unless it meets the test of what's going on in the world. It's now possible, thanks to this new movement towards the science of subjective well-being, that we have millions of answers from around the world from people who were asked Aristotle's question, and we can test whether Aristotle's propositions hold, and by and large they do. Now that takes me one more stage. First of all, there are 3 kinds of life evaluation questions used. There's the so-called Cantrell ladder in the World Happiness Report that's used in the Gallup World Poll. It says, think of your life as a ladder with the best possible life for you as a 10 and the worst as a 0. How do you rank your life today? The second way of asking the question, and this is recommended by the OECD guidelines for national statistical agencies, and it's the most widely used question in the world, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole on a scale from 0 to 10? There's a third way of asking the question, which has been used in the European Social Survey and other surveys. How happy are you with your life as a whole? Now, as Amartya Sen has said, and is apparent, there is a linguistic distinction between are you happy now and are you happy about your life? One is a judgment, the other is an emotion, and the answers are very different. And that's good for the science, because the answers are different in just the way they should be. So that the life evaluations depend much more on the characteristics of people's lives. The emotions depend much more on what is going on at that moment or at that day. So there are weekend effects in happiness yesterday. There are no weekend effects, if you ask surveys on different days of the week, there are no weekend effects for the life evaluations. That's good. The other is, and the United Kingdom is now, they're very big in this field now. They've been collecting official data with a high degree of political support for now almost 4 years. And they have data for life satisfaction. They have happiness yesterday. They have anxiety yesterday. And they have a third type of way, another type of evaluating life or its supports, and that's a life meaning or life purpose. Now, Aristotle said that the good life, as measured by a life evaluation, would depend on life circumstances, and we'll go into some of those, but it will also be supported on the one side by positive emotions and be supported on the other side by a sense of life purpose. And that's exactly what the British data show. So that the life evaluation is the central measure within which life circumstances show, and it's supported by positive emotions and life purpose. When we use these different measures, positive affect, negative affect, and life evaluations, to look across the countries of the world, it's the life evaluations that differ, and in inexplicable ways, among nations. The emotion differences are much more random and much less dependent on life circumstances. So I'm going to be talking a bit tomorrow about the World Happiness Report, but I have 30 minutes today and I have 10 minutes tomorrow. So instead of taking it all out of this presentation, which is going to be about how policy and data are working. I will give you a little bit about the World Happiness Report and Mexico's position in it. But first, I want to say something about what it's necessary to do to have a happiness revolution in a country. And it seems to me you need 4 things. One, or in the world, you need good data. And that's good data not just about how people evaluate their happiness, but knowledge about the lives of those people so that the science can develop to understand what makes better lives. The second thing we need is good science, and the science can only proceed as fast as the data are there, and the science in turn feeds back to inform what kind of data it is important to collect. The third necessary thing, and this is very important, and the United Kingdom understood this well, you need public enthusiasm. You need people saying to their governments and to each other, we need to assess the quality of life in our communities, and we want to know what it was. So the National Statistical Office in London went out in the streets with their cameras, and they interviewed people on the streets and said, what makes you happy? And had these kind of conversations, and there was a long time as they thought about, and they got feedback from people, and there's really now quite a wide degree of public support for this and understanding of what makes a better life in the general population. And third, you need governments that are willing to take a risk, because the kinds of policies that are needed are policies that engage and empower those at the bottom. They do not come from the top down. Let me tell you the 6 factors we have found in the World Happiness Report, looking across the data all over the world, and it's probably suitable at this time for me to see if I can get there. Where should I point this? Could we go through to the 4th slide, please? That's it, thank you. So that slide then shows you the actual national values averaged over 2010, 2012 of the answers to the Cantrell letter, and it shows the predicted values from a model that contains 6 variables. The 6 variables are GDP per capita, you'll be familiar with that one. Healthy life expectancy, also a familiar instrument of development efforts and policies. Then we start getting into fresher ground. The one variable that our research has showed to be very important in supporting life is trust. Trust in your neighbors, trust in your colleagues, trust in police, trust in public institutions. All these forms of trust are important. A belief that if you dropped your wallet in the street, it would be found and returned to you. That's more than just honesty. That's your neighbors stepping out and helping you to live in such a country, and credibly believe that about your neighbors is very important. Let me warn you that the world we live in is too pessimistic about our neighbors. So I will give you one particular story to take home, because if you believe this, it should help to change your life. When we were asking questions in surveys about trust, the general question is, do you think that people can be trusted? Or on the other hand, you can't be too careful in dealing with people? That had been used for 50 years all over the world. Some of my skeptical colleagues says that is too vague. So we invented another question, because we knew that readers Digest had dropped wallets in cities all over the world and seen how frequently they were returned. So we asked a particular question. We said, if you dropped your wallet with $200 in it, how likely do you think it is to be returned if it was found by a neighbor, a police officer, a clerk in the local store, or a stranger? And then we have answers from all over the country. We got the Gallup World Poll to include that question in one round. Unfortunately, when they got into the middle of Africa and found a country where nobody carried wallets, they got nervous and stopped. We could have found a better answer to that solution. But it was taken up in major Canadian surveys. So then when a Toronto newspaper decided to repeat the Reader's Digest experiment, they dropped 20 wallets in bustling downtown Toronto, where actually they were found by strangers because they were fictitious wallets. And we knew, with a probability of very small, how much people in Toronto thought their wallet would be returned. The average Torontonian thought that there was a 25% chance that their wallet would be returned if found by a stranger. The actual number of wallets returned was 16 out of 20. So the actual number was 80%. The expected number was 25%. The chances of us, because this would apply, I'll bet, equally well in Guadalajara as in Toronto, our neighbors are much nicer than we believe them to be, and we make ourselves unhappy when we believe that falsely about them. So I'm not saying you should believe false wonderful things about your neighbors, but stop believing false bad things about your neighbors, because we know it has an impact. If you think other people will return your wallet, you are much more likely to return their wallet. You're much more likely to greet them in the street with a friendly wave or knowledge, because you're part of a larger we, and that we is the we that will pick up a wallet and do a favor for other people. So this was the first evidence we have found, that absolutely strong, that there's this systematic over-skepticism about other people's goodwill. And of course that does terrible things for trust, because if you don't meet people, you don't trust them, and there's a negative circle. So let me leave that as a take-home for you, because of the 6 variables I've talked about, I've got to one which was trust. It's measured in the Gallup World Poll, unfortunately, because they stopped this wallet question in the middle of Africa. We only have measures of people, whether they think trust in government corruption in government is a problem, and corruption in business, and we use the average of those 2 measures. And that turns out to be very important. Another variable that is big in the UNDP analysis and jumps out of the data is freedom. The particular question is, do you have freedom to make your key life decisions? And that turns out to be a very strong support for. So you could say nobody out there in the world wants a top-down policy that's supposed to deliver well-being. They want the freedom to make their own decisions. The next one is absolutely fundamental, and most surveys do not measure these things very well, but if they are measured well, they turn out to be enormously important. And it's a range of mixtures of social connections and social support. The Gallup question used is, in times of trouble, do you have a friend or relative on whom you could count? And it turns out to be enormously important in explaining the international differences. And finally, and unusually and importantly, is generosity. That has hardly ever in the historical literature, and certainly not in the development literature, has generosity been understood and harnessed to improve happiness. Because of course, if people are happier if they're more generous, then of course you set up everything differently. Now, in this panel and in this conference, you're going to hear about some lovely examples of that going on. That what you really knew, if you want to make people happy, is you don't deliver them fancier services, you deliver them the capacity to build better lives for themselves and others. So that when I had the good fortune to visit Copenhagen after the last report came out, and Mike Viking was my host, and I asked him to take me to the Lotte Care Home, where they do marvelous things, and it's quite apparent from what they do and the way they do it. No extra resources, but simply an entirely different way. So these people in the last stages of Alzheimer's disease are in fact busy going to movies and looking after each other in a way that is a life worth living, and of course they live longer and happier lives because of that. Let me give you one more story, because science has to be done with hard data, but it is only remembered with stories, that spurred my interest in going to the Lotte Care Home, which is famous all over the world for what they have done. That we had done some experiments in a care home in Exeter, in England, where we'd taken 2 floors of a home, an unhappy floor and a happy floor. They were moved over to a new facility, and so the treatment was to give a new professionally designed social space to the happy floor. The unhappy floor was told to design their own social space. And so when the experts saw what the unhappy floor had done, they said they will never use that. It's not any good. But of course, you will already have guessed that when they moved across, the unhappy floor used their self-designed social space 50% more than the professional space was used by the other floor, and they were much happier. They were happier because they had worked together to do something to good purpose. Their trips to the doctors went down, their mental acuity rose, and they, having been the unhappy floor, became the happy floor with that tiny intervention. So I wanted to export this to other countries, so we brought a lot of care home managers in Ontario and Canada together, and we told them these stories. And at the end of the day, I said, if we can get that kind of effect from a tiny little tweaking in an experimental context, what would happen if we did something really important? Like taking young people out of the prisons of daycare and the elder people out of the prisons of elder care, the way we run them, and put them together and help them to produce wisdom and happy lives for each other. And the woman next to me gave me an elbow and said, "I have a story for you." "Tell it," I said. And she said, "Well, last summer, we had a crisis in our care home because most of our staff are women with children, and most of the daycare is associated with schools, and in the summer they have a problem. So we lose staff and they lose daycare. And so we decided to set up a day camp for the children in the elder care facility." And I said, "How did it work?" And she said, "It was wonderful." And by all measures, she showed us some pictures. But the really telling evidence, she said, was that in that care home, they had 3 or 4 people called wanderers. Can you guess what that is? So a wanderer is the reason why most care homes have locked doors and why people are in prison in that care home, because people leave. During the 3 weeks that camp was in operation, not one of the wanderers tried to wander. So that tells you 2 things. One, that those people had much better mental powers than they were thought to have. They knew what home was, and they knew that that home wasn't home, and they were trying to go home. As soon as that facility became a home, even with a synthetic family of imported children, it was home to them and they did not want to leave. So that is the strongest kind of vote. Well, when I'm talking about policies, I make a distinction between sort of overall policies and a second, which is how things are done. And this story about the care home is all about the how. It's not about resources. It's not about rules. It's in a way, it's about rules, because I asked this woman when she ran this summer camp, I said, that must have meant breaking quite a lot of rules. And she said, oh, yes. And so it's that kind of nerve that you need, because you could imagine what would happen if something went wrong in this kind of environment. The people who recover from mental illness best are given the job of helping other people recovering from that illness. You know, the caregiver effect is not negative. It isn't people being driven down by the pressures of caring for others. It's being raised up by the opportunity to care for others. People are now studying in cancer-peer relations who gets the benefit. It turns out the benefits are even bigger to the people who give the care than to receiving that care. So that's a very important thing to unlock in the how, change the way in which these services are organized and delivered. You'll be hearing stories from Alejandro Adler later today about the big experiments they're doing in this vein in the school system in Peru. And Mike's going to talk about his community work. And I've just given you an example from healthcare. And I think that's where a lot of the action in policy application is going to come from now, because the science is far enough involved. I think I wrote a paper that some of you I know have read on the Singapore prison system, showing you could take these same principles and apply them to the management of a prison system and make it a very different place with very different consequences, where prisoners don't come back as recidivists, they come back as volunteers to help other prisoners. Now I'm going to shift to the picture. I wanted to put that picture there so you could see that, in fact, those 6 variables alone explain 3/4 of the differences across countries and over time. And Mexico sits there, and so do several of its Latin American partners. The yellow squares, or the yellow circle, the yellow donut in Mexico's case, above the line. And so there is the question you'll be addressing on Wednesday is, why is Mexico high? It's high in part, I mean, in this survey, it's just about tied with the United States. Now, of all the 6 variables, the United States is equal or higher than Mexico on all of them. So Mexico's got this extra unexplained happiness that you have every right to expect you can keep, but it means there's no reason not to work on these other 6 factors. You don't want to assume you've got all those just because you've got the high score. Increasingly, people are asking, there are cultural differences in how people answer questions, but I know, I'm pretty sure in the Latin American case, it's much more than that. It's about some aspects of the social connections in the streets and in the homes that make people feel at home and connected and belonging, and all of those are very important supports for well-being. And so other countries maybe have something to learn for what's going on and how it's done. So when you push up on these other factors to support well-being, make sure you cherish what you've already got in terms of these connections. But remember, if you change the way in which government services are designed and delivered in the ways you'll hear about at this conference quite a lot, I guarantee that will increase the happiness of the people who design the service, the people who deliver the service, and the people who receive the service. You'll be creating a larger we and getting rid of many us-them distinctions. And we know the latter are very bad for happiness, so people don't like to fight with each other. So I'm going to move to the next slide, if I may. Next one. That's just income. Next one again, please. Well, I'll stick with this one. It's okay. All right. This is a slide I can spend a lot more than my remaining 2 minutes on. But if you're a devil for punishment, you'll be here tomorrow afternoon when we can carry on this discussion at a shorter space. This is showing you the changes between before the economic crisis and after the economic crisis. This model explains for the regions of the world about 3/4 of those differences. For individual countries, it's much smaller, though still very significant. The story I tell with those donuts is that the 4 dark green donuts at the bottom are Spain, Italy, Greece, and Portugal, the 4 most hit Eurozone countries, and their well-being was predicted to fall, but it fell much more than it was predicted to do. And I have been arguing that that's because the social compact, social contract, social capital in those countries was put to pressures that it did not easily withstand. And so they ended up being more against one another. You could tell that from the headlines, and you could see it easily in the streets, that these were not happy times. But that's too easy to say, so if I'm to make that case in a negative way for those countries, I have to have a counterexample of countries who had high levels of social connection and willingness to treat a crisis as an opportunity as well as a damage. And the 2 I used were Iceland and Ireland. Iceland and Ireland had banking systems that were destroyed more than almost any other 2 countries. And they had severe economic losses, but their well-being did not suffer. And the reason it did not suffer is that in both countries you can see the ways in which they used the crisis as a chance to rethink how they did things within that country. And of all the countries in the world, the 2 top countries in which people had someone to count on in times of trouble are Ireland and Iceland. Thank you.
Thank you. It turns out to be we're always eager to continue to listen more about this topic and this relationship, and calling the attention probably here of Mexicans, why we are among the happiest people in the world when we are so laid behind in so many areas. But it is part of what we are listening to today. I'm going to introduce to you next our next speaker now, who is Viking, if I'm pronouncing it well. He is from Denmark. He is a manager from Denmark, director of the Institute of Happiness Research in Denmark. He has a title on public administration and business administration from Roskilde University. He has worked for the international affairs in Denmark. He is director of a think tank in Scandinavia called Monday Morning. He participates in blogs in Denmark, and I thank him very much for being present in this forum.
Buenos dias, and thank you. And thank you for the kind invitation from the state of Jalisco to this important event. Does this work? Can I have the next slide, please? So, as mentioned, my name is Mike Viking, and I have the pleasure of being the director of the Happiness Research Institute. We are an independent think tank which focuses on well-being, on happiness, and on quality of life. So what we try to do is we advise policymakers, mayors, companies, foundations in Denmark and beyond on how to create better framework conditions for better lives. I just have two examples of some of the projects that we've done over the past year. The first report, we try to look at the different explanations for the reason that Denmark often do well in the international happiness rankings. And the second report, which will be published in about a month's time, we've looked at the different theories that explain why people who live sustainable lives also, on average, report higher levels of happiness. So basically, this is the core question that gets me up in the morning and the rest of my team. We try to figure out what does happy people have in common, or what do happy societies have in common. But what I want to talk to you about for the next 18 minutes is this one. Thank you. A report we published earlier this year, which is the first happiness study for a Danish town. I want to talk a little bit about the results from that study, but also what this study tells us about the mega trends that are happening right now within the global well-being agenda. And there's about 8 trends I want to mention in that regard. So just a little background for the study. Thank you. It's a very small town just outside Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. It's called Dragør, which I know is completely impossible to pronounce if you are a non-Danish speaker. But it's a small town with around 14,000 inhabitants, and it's also a quite rich town. So the average income is almost twice as high as the average one in Denmark. Okay? So what we did, now I just have to swing it, it's really nice. What we did was, just as John mentioned earlier, there are these different dimensions of happiness, and we try to quantify the different dimensions of quality of life for people in the city. So we surveyed around 5% of the adult population and tried to quantify both the life evaluation that John mentioned earlier, but also the affective ones. So both the evaluation, but also the kind of emotion that people go through on an everyday basis. So once we had those data sets, we tried to detect patterns for barriers when it came to unhappiness among the citizens. What were the drivers of quality of life? What were the barriers for happiness in the city? And based on those data sets, based on those patterns, we came up with a set of recommendations together with the citizens to hand over to the city government in order to increase happiness in the city. Can I have the next one, please? And I think the collaboration between us and the city government represents one of the megatrends that we are witnessing these years, as also this conference is an example of today. And that is a desire or an ambition to measure what matters. As we heard about this morning, for years we've been measuring whether we were getting richer, whether the economy is growing. That's important too. But equally important is to see whether lives are actually improving. And we're seeing city governments, national governments, we all heard about Bhutan, we heard about UK this morning as well, but we see increasingly additional governments looking into measuring progress in new ways. And that is, of course, a positive thing. So let's see some of the results from our study. And there are good news and there are bad news. So if we start with the good news, we could see both when it came to life evaluations, but also affective dimension, that the people in this town were quite happy. They were actually a bit happier than the average Dane. We saw satisfaction with life levels and happiness levels of around 7.6 and 7.8, which is quite high. I'll just dive into some of the life evaluation and get back to the bad news. What we could see when we had this question, such as how happy do you feel all in all, as the one John mentioned earlier, we could see that around 65% of the people in our town said 8, 9, or 10, which is quite high. However, there are still people in the city that report somewhat low levels of happiness. And what we could see was that there were two main obstacles or two main barriers when it came to happiness. We've already mentioned some of them this morning. First one was a lack of purpose. And the other one was social isolation or loneliness, if you will. What we could see was that 15% of our citizens said that they were experiencing loneliness in their everyday lives. But as we also heard earlier, being alone, wanting to be with other people is just one dimension of happiness. We also have the qualitative dimension of loneliness. Do you have somebody in your network you can rely on in terms of need? Is there somebody you can discuss personal matters with? Those are also important but often overlooked dimensions of loneliness. And we can see in our town around 8 or 9% of people actually experience that dimension. But I think the most worrying number is the 10%. 1 in 10 of our citizens said that they could not see an overall purpose with their life. And I think it's worrying for two reasons. First, I think it's a really strong statement. If somebody came to me and said, Mike, I really can't see a purpose with my life, I would think that that person might be suicidal. Secondly, remember this number is from a questionnaire. It's from a survey. And there's still some social stigma attached to admitting that you do not see an overall purpose with your life. So I would actually suspect that the actual number is even higher than 10%. The good news is that in Denmark and in a lot of other places, there is an increasing awareness of the importance of social connectivity and at least an attempt to reduce social isolation. Every time I meet a politician in Denmark, I usually bring this graph because it tells us something about the connection between social relationships and happiness. In our survey, we asked people how satisfied they were with their social relationships, and we divided them into 4 groups. Those that were not at all satisfied with their relationship, to a little degree, to some degree, and to a high degree. And it might be difficult for you guys to see over here, but the number on top of the bar is that given group's average happiness level. Okay? So the group to the right said that they were very much satisfied with their social relationships. That group had an average happiness level of 8.3, which is quite high. In the other end of the scale, you have those that were not at all satisfied with their social relationships. That group had an average happiness level of 3.3. Now I look at these numbers every day, so I know how extremely low that level is. It is the lowest level we could detect in any group in our town. And just for comparison reason, John mentioned the Cantrell ladder in the World Happiness Report earlier. There's 156 countries included in the report. I think there's only one, Togo, which has a lower average happiness level than our socially isolated group in the town. So that's just for comparison reason. Now, for those of you that work with statistics, you want to know what is the correlation. And for you that don't work with statistics, you want to know what is a correlation. So our correlation tells us about how much 2 factors are connected, and is a number between -1 and 1. And the further we get away from 0, the stronger is the relationship between those 2 factors. So for example, if we have a perfect correlation of 1, it can be the temperature in Fahrenheit and the temperature in Celsius. If we have one, we can determine the other. A correlation of 0.5, which is close to this correlation, is, for example, the relationship between the height of the father and the height of the son. So if your father is tall, you're also likely to be tall, but not necessarily because your mother's height and your diet plays a factor. Okay? So that's just to give you some bearings. Our relationship between the social connectedness and happiness is almost 0.5. It's 0.452. And just for comparison reason, we can see also, which is a acknowledged relationship between education level and household income. The longer you go to school, the more money your household is likely to earn. And we can see that correlation in Denmark is 0.372, so it's actually less than the correlation between our relationships and happiness. That's just a testimony to how strong it is. Okay, let's move on. Okay, and I think another trend which this study also represents is an expansion of the notion of health. So we're going from health being just physical health to now also including mental health. And we see that nationally. There was recently 7 new national goals for Denmark. 2 out of those 7 goals focused on mental health. And I think our study is also an expression of that. The study we did for the city will feed into the new health strategy for the town. And what that means is that hopefully the town will say, okay, so 15% of our people are lonely or are socially isolated. Can we make that number 10% in the year 2020? For me, those are the kind of questions a rich society asks, using those benchmarks to seeing whether our society is moving in the right direction. Can I have the next one, please? Thank you. So another trend is that we're seeing that happiness or well-being, quality of life, is increasingly being used as a PR tool for cities and governments. So Denmark often do quite well in the happiness rankings, and that causes a lot of media interest. So at our think tank, we get a call from an international journalist, maybe every 2 weeks, who wants to know about why do Denmark do well. But we wanted to figure out whether that had had an effect, all that media coverage, whether that media coverage had had an effect on people's perception of Denmark, whether it had led to increased tourism, for example. So we did a small survey among the international tourists in Copenhagen and asked them whether they had heard of Denmark's position as one of the happiest countries in the world. And 7 out of 10 people said yes. But I think more interestingly was that out of those people, 40% said that that had in some way played an influence on them choosing Denmark as a destination. So governments, cities, national governments can use this also as a tool to attract talent and tourism. Yes, next one please. And I think that's part of, only part of, but part of the reason why we see an increased political interest in happiness and using happiness as a goal. And we covered that a lot this morning already, so we'll skip to the next one. Because we should also be mindful. Can we have the next one, please? Thank you. We should also be mindful that there is a counter trend, not having happiness as a political goal. Now, after we did the study for the city, it also caused quite a heated debate between me and some of the national politicians in Denmark. One politician wrote that the state should not and cannot create happiness for the people. It's up to the people themselves to create their own unhappiness. Oh, sorry, to create their own happiness. So we replied with, if you're a politician that think that you cannot create a framework that creates quality of life for the people, why are you sitting in our government? Then of course that politician got mad, but I think we should acknowledge the skepticism towards having happiness as a political goal. Another skepticism that we took as a result of the study was this one. It was written about the study in one of the major newspapers in Denmark. I'll just read it aloud with you. It said, "Another hippie camp is established where even more welfare addicts can chant more resources, more resources, more resources." And of course, we should be mindful, because of these skepticism and objections, how we label our initiatives and political goals. We already talked about it this morning, how happiness especially, but also in some ways well-being, can be perceived as somewhat fluffy. So be mindful of what we name our initiatives. Okay, so the upside is that happiness, well-being, also holds a convening power. People are profoundly interested in this field. People want to find out what are the mechanics of happiness, what are the drivers of well-being. And I think the sheer volume of this conference is a testimony to that fact. So once we published the town study, it also became one of the largest citizen workshops the town had ever had. People wanted to take part in the discussion on how to create better lives for people in our town. And this picture you see is where the citizens are voting on what recommendations they wanted to put forth. They did not like this one. That's why you see all the red ones. But last week I spoke to the mayor of the town that had the study, and I asked him, what do you think was the most important contribution of the study? And he actually mentioned this graph, and what it meant was that our study has created additional awareness of the power of being an active citizen. A bit like John mentioned earlier, taking part in your local community, being part in developing frameworks for better lives in your community, for yourself and for your neighbors, are conducive to happiness. And he thought, because of that study, additional people have started to volunteer for different organizations within the city because of that study. I was really glad to hear that. Okay. Yes. We're running out of time, but one of the final trend that we see, and this is especially in Denmark, is the establishment of these platforms for social connectivity. And that also links back to what John mentioned earlier. The ability to trust people in your community is linked to happiness. And we see people, especially in Copenhagen, but also elsewhere in Europe, longing for social connectivity, even in larger cities. People are longing for sort of village spirit, even in big cities. So we're seeing a lot of initiatives that is trying to bring people together in their local communities. And one example of that are these, we call them urban gardens or community gardens, where people come together across socioeconomic barriers to seed and harvest and eat vegetables together. And it's not because there is a vegetable shortage in Denmark, it's just because it's a platform where people can meet their neighbors. And these pictures are actually from a concrete initiative we did ourselves, because we thought that urban gardens was such a great idea that we wanted to do one ourselves. We wanted to be not just a think tank, but also a do tank. So we created a garden ourselves just across our office, and it's of course called the Happiness Garden. And we try to create additional vitality and community spirit in our neighborhood. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Viking, for telling us about this first world country experience. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we're going to our next speaker. He is Rodolfo de la Torre. He is a Mexican economist who is the coordinator on the reports on human development from Mexico. And let me give you a brief resume about him. He studied economy master's degree from ITAM, and he has a major degree for economy from Oxford University, especially working on public administration, and he was a professor on poverty and development and inequality. He was director of the Center of Research at ITAM and founding member of the Institution on Sustainable Research and Social Equality in the Iberoamerican University, and he is now the president of the Mexican chapter on the Network of Poverty in Latin America and Caribbean, and he was founding member of the Latin American Association, the Caribbean of Human Capacities. Rodolfo de la Torre Garcia, welcome. Good morning. Before anything, I have to tell you it is a pleasure for me to be here at Guadalajara and to be here with you talking about these topics. Guadalajara is one of the most developed cities in our country. It is among the 3 top cities in Mexico. But let me start by saying something that is not so happy. A while ago, we had demonstrators here in our classroom talking about such a sad event, the possible death of 43 students or students who were disappeared at Ayotzinapa, at the state of Guerrero, one of the poorest states within Mexico. And such event now serves me in order to mention that probably this kind of events have not emerged from this support now. No, they come from so far behind. It has been a problem for so many years in our country, and we need to remember that we need to place these problems in the context of this of what we are referring to today. Probably the positive face of this, the positive side, is if we refer to the survey made on happiness levels at the different municipalities, you will find that at Iguala City, where these problems started, they have ranked 66 in terms of happiness within our country, while Guadalajara, where we are based today, it's at 70, is ranked 70, less happy than Iguala. So what I want to show you next is a call to prudence when approaching a subjective well-being concept and when using indicators and ideas behind it. This of course doesn't mean forgetting about them or not including them in policy making, but I want you to consider this when referring to these discussions that we are just starting today. If we go to my presentation, please. I would like to tell you about the correspondence degree between objective well-being and subjective well-being. My screen is ready. In order to pose to you a problem, and it is that sometimes they don't match what people express about life satisfaction and happiness with objective measurements as health, knowledge, or income. A knowledge level and income level that different indicators tell us about. So if there are differences, what place we're going to give to each kind of information. So for this, we need a concept framework, and And this concept framework, this is the one I have taken as a starting point, and it might vary in different research work at different institutions, but the question should be, where is well-being heading to when we confront such or both ways of expressing what's happening with people without neglecting material well-being. Material well-being is important as well if we think where the non-material well-being goes to. And I will try to to define what does this mean to public policy making. And let's talk about the concept framework for well-being. But before that, I need to give you this information that I told you earlier might seem a paradox. In this chart, you are able to observe by the red line the happiness level that has been declared by people according to the World Value Score for different countries, and the Human Development Index, the indicator that the UN program has used to rank countries in terms of achievements on health, education, and income. And the first indicator is a subjective one. The other comes from statistical information, as it is mortality rate as a given country, structure of the country, education level, or national accounts. And what I want you to observe is that despite the fact there is a near correlation between both aspects, there are also notable differences. For example, Germany has a Human Development Index that is much higher than Mexico's. This is the first arrow we can observe in my chart. The second arrow is Mexico. And however, Mexico has a happiness level higher than that expressed at Germany. So this kind of information yields larger differences when we review other indicators, more subjective, like life satisfaction index. This is a component within the recent measurement about happiness, how well people are doing, done by the OECD. And you might see that life satisfaction is remarkably different among countries. Here we can see in the yellow, with the yellow line, we are able to see life satisfaction, and the blue line is Human Development Index. Now, if we consider Japan, a country that has high human development life satisfaction index, is really low. However, in Mexico, with less human development, we score larger life satisfaction. So what does this mean? What does this kind of information refer to? Let's review the concept framework that I told you earlier. For a long time, well-being has been thought to find its base in material resources, wealth, health, or capital, or through production, or through the income coming from production, or also consumption. Consumption level has also referred to material well-being, but recently, however, the idea of subjective well-being has been brought to the table in terms of satisfaction of life and individual well-being. The difference is that between these two extremes, we have a core concept on a level of life or lifestyle, and that refers to the freedom of people to be whatever they want to be. Trying to be happy is part of this, but it is not only that. The idea is that we have media that can be transformed accordingly in order to be able to act and be. And then we value from different standpoints that freedom through our perceptions, the perceptions that correspond to happiness, satisfaction, as well as other subjective indicators.
So based on this perception, we can better understand to a certain degree what each element contributes with for the well-being overall concept. So firstly, we have to remember, and I will not detail much this information, we have to know that there's a material well-being that is still important, and there's a series of conclusions as derived from the conclusion of many experts. For example, John to see, just to mention one amongst many that got together to conclude on these facts. And the material well-being is important. Now, incomes have to be evaluated. Incomes, not only the GDP per se, but furthermore, we have to go into more detailed aspects. We have to emphasize the home and household income, the wealth, and never take these concepts separately, because we might have inconsistent results. We also have to understand consumption, wealth, as well as income inequalities. Furthermore, we need to understand that markets are different, and some markets are not monetized. We have to understand that as well. We would like to focus on the following: the non-material well-being analysis, and it has to do with the multi-dimensions that David mentioned when presented this morning during the opening ceremony, and how relevant it is when analyzing life and happiness. So one of the many conclusions that evaluated social progress and economic performance is aimed at the fact that the quality of life depends on objective situations and the capacities or capabilities of the people. Now, that doesn't rule out other elements, for example, material well-being or the subjective well-being for that matter. Let's move forward, please. One before. When I talk about capacities or skills, I mean the following. Our lives are made up by minor events, for example, moments, if I may. For example, being healthy, being well-nourished, learn how to read and write, being protected against violence and assault of any kind. Well, all that together means that we are in a status that can render skills or capacities, and that is having the freedom to live our own life. For example, the physical integrity and the biological integrity, all the way to more elaborated skills. And by that I mean being productive in a society, any given society. So that means that there's open options so that we can live our lives the way we decide to do so, and satisfaction and happiness are part of this overall framework. So in order to understand capacities, we need to consider the following. We need to avoid premature death. We have to maintain biological efficiency. And I could continue mentioning what's written on the slide. These are the 10 different multi-dimensions that have to be considered for well-being. I will not read all of them, but there's one I would like to highlight, and that is having the opportunity to experience pleasure and avoid pain. Not only from a sensorial perspective, but there's other elements to it when it comes to subjectivity. Very well. I would like to now include another core recommendation. For example, life indicators should have a comprehensive understanding of inequalities. And by that I mean we need to understand dimensions from a material perspective, as well as the subjective well-being and freedom. But furthermore, the commission that examined these aspects elaborated that interactions amongst different arenas of life should be analyzed. So subjective well-being or material well-being or freedom should not be analyzed individually, but furthermore, they should be analyzed co-jointly, because there's an interdependence amongst the concepts aforementioned. Amongst some of the most important recommendations, we understand that there's information that is gathered by the statistical bureaus regarding priorities of every single dimension. And the weighing of said dimensions derive from people, derive from how people see into these factors. There's an important spot here, or room for people to express themselves when elaborating on their perception, their subjective perception, which has an important role when analyzing the elements of well-being. Moreover, it has been mentioned that there has to be specific surveys when evaluating or assessing individuals regarding their lives and their pleasurable moments and their priorities, because regardless of how weight is put upon on the elements, these aspects have to be analyzed from an individual standpoint. Now, people can have a perception, and that, of course, includes a series of elements, one of which is the subjective well-being we are referring to. So happiness, satisfaction are, amongst others, status or standards that people value. So the mood at which you are at any given moment has implications in order to determine objective variables. The mood then has an influence on our health. Our mood has an influence on the possibility or likelihood of getting a job and how well we can perform when working. So one core skill or capacity that we need to foster is avoiding pain and having the pleasure or enjoying pleasure, always trying to be part of an overall scheme that can be translated to a meaningful scenario. So subjective well-being is just one of the many elements for human development. So subjective well-being is a resource for the human development, and furthermore, subjective well-being gives us the relative weight for objective variables of well-being. There's boundaries or constraints that have to be underscored when talking about subjective well-being. The subjective well-being cannot be the central focus or aim of the public policies, because then happiness and satisfaction and other elements can be put aside, and that is not proper. Being satisfied or being happy does not mean that we are autonomous. Having the ability to determine our destiny within some limitations have to be considered. Now, many elements of this subjective well-being can be lost when getting certain freedom. So when getting freedom, we can lose some, we get freedom here, but we can lose it in other aspects. There's also a frustration that can be built upon. And that frustration doesn't necessarily reflect the when lacking things. For example, poor people that are happy might not be subject to public policies if the most important indicators are based upon subjective well-being. We need to foster freedom so people attain their goals, but that freedom, of course, goes beyond subjective well-being per se. Furthermore, subjective well-being goes to unidimensional measurements. That is in most of the cases. When it comes to economics or economy, it's very frequent to talk about the profit as if it were a magic number. Profits that we can gain when living our life, and multidimension is then lost when analyzing it from that standpoint. So subjective well-being should maintain the multi-dimension at all times. Oftentimes, this subjective well-being is not so much manipulated, and that frequently depends on a series of factors that are outside public policies. So public policies can hinder because of objectives that cannot be attained. And finally, the subjective well-being can become adapted or well adapted. as well as unstable. Let's say that we have a different series of questions, or the moment during which I ask the questions are not the proper ones, or people are going through a difficult moment. So the maintaining the subjective well-being is not guaranteed, and it will depend on culture, aspirations, or moods, as well as state of mind. So this is a number of constrictions we have to always consider. I would like to conclude by saying that the subjective well-being and human development are critical when is not so much manipulated, and that frequently depends on a series of factors that are outside public policies. So public policies can hinder because of objectives that cannot be attained. And finally, the subjective well-being can become adapted or well adapted, as well as unstable. Let's say that we have a different series of questions, or the moment during which I ask the questions are not the proper ones, or people are going through a difficult moment. So the maintaining the subjective well-being is not guaranteed, and it will depend on culture, aspirations, or moods, as well as state of mind. So this is a number of constrictions we have to always consider. I would like to conclude by saying that the subjective well-being and human development are critical when understanding the happiness and well-being. We, of course, have gone beyond analyzing these concepts from the perspective of having more, meaning being more, or feeling better. We are past beyond that. Now the focuses look alike to a certain extent. Individuals are not experts when defining their own well-being, despite the fact that we are being told so. There are many individuals, and I include myself, that can be very satisfied with certain type of foods and badly nourished. But from the nutritional perspective, or the nutritionalist perspective, we would guide the satisfaction of the person, focusing on the maintaining of the well-being. And finally, the subjective well-being indicates that there's some subjectivity factors that have to be explored even further. But not only satisfaction and well-being, the autonomy of people, as well as psychosocial resources, and that is the psychological characteristics that can make us progress. And very frequently the circumstances that make us define on subjective elements that are also needing for care. So let's be enthusiastic when developing this topic. Let's be happy about this, but we have to be prudent when doing so. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Rodolfo de la Torre. So not eating much means eating well, right? Being well nourished. Next, we have Gonzalo Hernandez Licona. He's Executive Secretary of the Coneval, Mexico's National Evaluation Council. He also a PhD from the Oxford University and a master's degree from the Essex University. He was graduated from the University of Mexico, and we would like to welcome him. Thank you very much for that introduction. Once again, welcome, and it's a pleasure to be in Guadalajara and in the state of Jalisco with all of you. I would like to extend my regards to all the secretaries that are responsible for the policies to be implemented throughout the states. That's where social policies are at ground level, out in the field, actually being implemented. And my regards and my compliments to all of them. At the Coneval, the National Evaluation Council, we always say that when anything that can be measured can be improved. And there's some true facts about this. When we don't know how things are doing, oftentimes it's because we cannot measure them. We don't know whether or not we are working on, or if we are on the right track. That's precisely why this type of seminar is so valuable. We are trying to find ways, different ways, that is, to measure the reality that per se is so complicated. And there's no easy ways to analyze from the government perspective, that is state and federal government, whether we are doing well or if we should go back and do it again. Measuring, then, is always important, And during this forum, we will, of course, have a clear idea about this. It's important to understand that it's very hard to find one single measure to indicate what's required when it comes to public policies. Apparently, we have many measures that have to be made so that we can have a clear guidance as to where policy should be heading. One measure doesn't always capture what's required. For example, GDP-based policies as the sole guide. And we have talked about this during this first morning session and in other sessions in the past. We understand that GDP is important, but it doesn't always tell us the whole story, the whole picture of a given country. We have to understand how to measure different elements when it comes to individuals. And during the opening ceremony, I was given the chance to say that when we analyze this from an individual perspective, what we are interested in, from our individual standpoint, we aim at certain goals, and we rest assured that there's a series of factors, not one factor, that will take us there. We, of course, have an immediate result that we are looking for, what we are looking for, what we have achieved in the past, how we felt back then, how we feel now, and that, all in all, includes a series of measures that tell us where to head. For example, the income or household income is utmost important. However, we need to understand basic services provided to the society as well as the capacity so that we can be skillful to achieve what we have set forward in our minds. The achievements in the past, expectations that we generate in our mind is also important. This series of expectations play an important role. All the elements I mentioned before play an important role. And finally, we have to talk about happiness. How do we feel today? How are we going to feel in future time? So from a national standpoint, we need to become aware of all these many elements we want to measure. Having said that, and given that we are trying to measure different aspects, let me highlight what the Mexican state has had as a priority. However, there's still much to do and still much to measure with that regard. And that is based on what's stated in the Constitution of Mexico, as well as the Social Development General Law. The Constitution gives us a guideline that is an important one, a very relevant one, on which we can act upon for the public servants and officials. This is one of the many articles of the Constitution. The United States of Mexico will or shall render the right to all the citizens, Mexican citizens, as acknowledged within the Mexican Constitution and in international constitutions, that these rights are ensured. So we as Mexicans have a very important and clear guidance implicating that the day-to-day, from a government standpoint, should always be present, focusing on access guaranteed to human rights by all citizens. Then we have Article 1 under this social development and Article 6 as well, eliciting that the law should guarantee the execution of the social rights. And Article 6 indicates that the rights for social development include education, health, food or nourishment, housing, as well as the joy of the healthy environment, work, and social security, and non-discriminating practices. So most of these aspects are, one way or another, connected and highly linked to social rights. Therefore, I do consider that it's an advantage for the Constitution to have that guidance and eventually being able to measure development with regards to universal access to these rights I mentioned before. In order to do this, from the perspective of understanding development in a comprehensive way, we need to know that Mexican nationals shall have these rights guaranteed. Furthermore, many economists and sociologists have included in their surveys information pertaining to societies that protect the rights of the majorities are those societies that work better and that generate more wealth, more material wealth included. Those places where rights are protected apparently have the innovation, investment, and competitiveness, as well as access to better jobs, or more jobs for that matter, and higher productivity levels, which are the wealth generators, as Mr. Smith said before. Apparently, the protection should be guaranteed for all. So in the medium term and long term, these societies will do better if we analyze this information. So at the end of the day, we should have societies that value everybody's ideas with the same rule or under the same parameters. Hence, we're talking about societies that give us value-added elements. Now, there are some societies or communities that have a very minor percentage of citizens that are entitled to or rightful to innovate and that they can invest. Well, those societies will give in return just a percentage, a minor percentage of those benefits to the society as a result of all this scheme. I would like to mention a story called The Tyranny. William Easterny is the author, The Tyranny of the Experts. And this author talks about the 11th century commerce and two traders. We have the Maghribs on the one hand, and the Maghribs were in a location of a Jew ascent, and they innovated to have good trading in place, given that their traders were brought all the way to the other side of the Mediterranean, and money, which was not common currency, could be sent to those remote places, and products or items, goods could be taken back. And they were very precise when doing so. The Maghrib network was possible because they only hired people that were part of the same ethnical group and religious group. They did not trust anybody else that was outside that ethnical group. Hence, all those that were part of this trading business during this 11th century were people that had the same race and ethnicity. And what happened is that they did not rely on anybody else. They didn't. And trust or relying on others is fundamental for any type of development. Likewise, there was an additional group in Geneva, Italy, that worked differently, totally differently. They, instead of relying on a small ethnical group that you are aware of, that you are acquainted with, they invested on justice systems that could apply to all. That means that they had contracts in place, contracts that we normally sign without being concerned about the ethnicity or religious aspects, would be based on fair trade and justice for all. The great difference is that the people from Geneva, Italy, expanded exponentially their trade because they confided on many others. Instead of one ethnical group, you could trust anybody that would abide by this Geneva contract rules or regulations. So that system led to good trade and fair trade, providing and ensuring trust to the society. And the community then could confide on anybody else, despite the fact that they would not belong to their own group, regardless of their ethnical background or religious. So what was actually happening was profound respect to the rights of everybody within that society, and that was later on translated on a more thriving society, a throbbing society, as opposed to Maghreb's society, which after some time was taken on by the Genovese society. So by that, I mean that whatever is stated under the Constitution of Mexico is still in the paper or in writing, is important to be followed on from the public servant's standpoint. Having the ability to implement justice plans or programs, respecting everybody's rights, and having universal access to social rights. I believe that being able to measure that would become, in the case of Mexico or any country in Latin America, a relevant aspect. Still today, Mexico unfortunately has not reached that universal access for social and human rights granted to all. If we could have a way or ways to measure up that type of situation, I rest assured that from our own perspective and from the role we play in the society, we could move forward. Maybe a happier, much happier, but even more developed society. And from a concrete perspective, we do believe that Mexico has had progress, but it has been partial when focusing on the rights granted to the society. And as we all know, here in Mexico, and our guests from abroad might be aware of this, the social development law mandates that we measure up poverty from a multidimensional perspective with a social right perspective in mind. This graph I now present, and most of you are very aware of this. Maybe you even have dreams about it. My friend Mark has seen it many times, and he reminds me of this graph constantly. It's from my very own personal judgment, a way to measure up the rights, of course including incomes, but we need to do more, way more, when measuring. Well, with this graph, this is what we can analyze. First and foremost, we have to analyze the poverty levels, or the society that is within poverty levels, under the argument of not having access to rights. Any person then that has one or two denied access to education, housing, basic services, and food nourishment, and that furthermore has an income situation or a condition that does not allow the family or the individual for the services to be rendered, we need to focus then on the core issue here. How do we measure up aspects so that we can guide public policies on a day-to-day basis? With this graph, we should understand how to decrease poverty levels, not only when income goes up, but furthermore, we need to increase coverage and access to which these people are ensured. Social services should be granted. If we were to analyze lower incomes, but no Mexican whatsoever having denied this access, we would not have multidimensional poverty. This graph also indicates the clear difference between poverty. Of course, poverty is indicated in green, in yellow, or orange, I should say. Now, in green, we see what we should or what we would like to have based on public policies in the coming years. We would like to have all Mexican nationals. One moment, because I have to go back. I moved forward by accident. One moment, please. We should ensure that Mexicans would have livable incomes without any social lack or lagging. Public policies then should be focused on social policies as well as income and economics, so that all Mexican nationals could be placed on the nirvana, on that green spot that I indicate as the well-being state. So the green frame would be where everybody would be located instead of the yellow or orange section. So by measuring up poverty based on social rights, apparently it's a different way as opposed to the traditional one that is only based on incomes. And this new approach includes social rights and many other factors that should be borne in mind. And day-to-day work should be based on this from a universal perspective. The way we are at in Mexico, as we speak, can be explained, as I stated before, with this type of lagging problems. In the year 2012, we had 61% worth of the population with social security or access to social security, and that was the highest number. Now, for many decades now, there was an agreement or an accord, a national accord, that included that social security was also linked to formal labor. So formal labor will lead to a social security number, and anything that social security provides the government in return when hiring personnel should maintain the access. However, after many decades, we still have a lag in that regard. We need to find different ways to approach this so that we can in turn provide Mexicans with better social services provided. Now, there's a hope that was appointed many years ago, and that is the following. Instead of having Social Security connected to formal labor, it should be universal. This is what happens in other countries. It's not only the fact of having social protection if you have a formal labor, but everybody should have access to it, regardless of their being in that labor sector or not. So if we could ensure that in the following years, we could guarantee universal access to Social Security amongst the other factors as well. Finally, I would like to state that when it comes to poverty, we have challenges ahead that we have to tackle, and these challenges have to do with social rights. These two graphs indicate that poverty in Mexico in the year 2012 was of 45%, and the indigenous population was of 72% poverty-wise. So when we see these bars or graphs, we need to understand that basic access to social rights should be more equal and granted to all. Apparently, the indigenous or the indigenous groups have not or have been denied the access and the joy of the universal rights. And in a country such as ours, where 100% of the population could be protected from a human right perspective and social right perspective, Mexico only then would be further developed and with a greater hope for happiness to be attained. Thank you for your attention this afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalo Hernandez Licona. Thank you. Well, now we are going to introduce to you our next speaker, Eric Vitrup. He has worked as a coordinator of training in the UNDP and ONU Habitat, or UN Habitat at Kosovo since 2002. He has been the main officer at Human Settlings for the Regional Office of Latin America and the Caribbean. He has been representative of Damasco at Syria, and he's currently the Syrian representative of ONU Habitat or UN Habitat in Mexico, and I welcome him today. So first of all, I want to ask of you, we are using this hashtag in Twitter. It is called hashtag Foro Bienestar. There you can set questions or you can participate if you wish through your smartphone, and if we have time by the end of this presentation, we are going to be reading these comments on Twitter, these tweets, and it is hashtag Foro Bienestar. If you have the opportunity to participate, welcome, Dr. Vitrup. Thank you. Good morning. And I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank the state of Jalisco for such an opportunity here to be able to share some of the ideas and advances we have had in terms of well-being and urban prosperity. UN Habitat is the agency, a special agency at the UN for urban living. And as we have seen earlier, every person who has presented here has enlightened us about happiness and well-being from their scope, from the conceptual to national policies to methodologies and challenges we have in these regards. So I'm going to point out my presentation on what we are concerned about as a UN agency, how all this discussion relates to the territory where we live. Most of us live at cities. So that's why the emphasis of my presentation has to do more on how to approach this topic of well-being and prosperity from the urban standpoint. So I will see if this works. Okay. There I go. So let me see if I'm able to make it work. Okay, so we are living this world with urban transition, urban population, turn of the city from the turn of the previous century to the last century, and then turning to this century, we have undergone a dramatic change. At the year 2004, most of the cities, or this planet became mostly urban for the first time in history. And let's see, and something that we're a lot concerned about, and something we all should be concerned about is urbanization of the planet. Urbanization phenomenon is growing very fast and is going to have great repercussions. It has turned us 4,000 years to become urban from the city of Ur 4,000 years ago, one of the main landmarks of humankind history. And to date, now we are half of the planet is urban. 3.5 billion people live in cities. And this is not dramatic, that's history. The dramatic aspect of this is the time we are living. Most of us, we will live up to 2050. We are going to double this endeavor. That is, we're going to double our urban population in less than 4 years from now. And obviously this is going to bring great repercussions. The 21st century is going to be urban mostly. And this means that we are going to need to provide urban space for the society, and for that we need to build a city as London, as big as London, on a monthly basis from now to the year 2050, in order to be able to provide a way of living to the people. And this has to do with the way we organize through cities. So today, urban sites are the dominant space that represent the new strengths, forces, powers, economies, key players, challenges, and opportunities for all of us. Density, integration, inclusion, connectivity, proximity, urban and agglomeration economies are subjects and are challenges that most of us face on a daily basis. And this is what we can call the transforming power of urbanization for prosperity. This is the humongous challenge that we have in front of us in order to provide a way of living for future generations. Undoubtedly, the city is the center for prosperity, but there is no doubt that we are living cities in crisis from many standpoints. We are seeing trigger factors as the recent tragic events that have occurred in Mexico. These are triggers of anxiety and anguish and the concern from many young people, but not only young people, but most of the citizens, about cities not working properly, and about the fact that cities should work better. And we know that. We know the cities are places where we can fight for the right of shared prosperity, as someone mentioned here earlier. And this is something we fully agree on. But we have to think about cities' prosperity as well. There is a distorted notion about prosperity that so far, and as mentioned here by several of the previous speakers, we have managed the topic on prosperity about accumulating wealth from the financial standpoint, considering cities in terms of real estate speculation. We talk about productive cities as if this was the thing that will generate prosperity by itself. We know it is a key element, but it won't work by its own. We have this gigantic contradiction that it doesn't surprise me. The most successful cities in the world, not all of them, but many of these cities, and many in Mexico, are at the same time the cities that provoke most of the inequality in the cities. How is it that we are able to produce 21st economies that produce inequality at the same time? That is a big contradiction. And this is something we need to understand, and this is something we have to face and approach. And this is one of the great challenges that urban leaders have. Mayors, municipal secretaries, governors, and everybody participating within a city in order to be able to rely on more efficient cities and more prosperous. So we have to rethink the topic regarding prosperity. As we have seen earlier, we need to integrate both tangible and intangible aspects of prosperity, something that addresses these inefficient and dysfunctional ways of work in the last century cities. We have tested so many things. We already know what is not working. So we have to rethink. We have to talk about a change that will transform such logic with or under a holistic vision that has a vision whose core is the people, that is inclusive and sustainable. I am so happy about hearing about Copenhagen experience and the expert from Canada's experience. Science has been able to prove that something that produces happiness is things that set us to work in a joint manner. And this reaffirms, of course, the vision we are fostering from UN Habitat. So, the 21st century, and we scientists have talked about most compact ways of working, less power consumption, a smaller ecological footprint. Cities must be the places where we promote heterogeneity to safeguard people from risks. This is the place to provide utilities, basic utilities, and to work with more efficiency. This is where we can contribute to the development, and all this to reduce disaster risk, and to reduce inequality, both social and economic. We can do this. We know we can do it. We can do it, but we are not doing it right so far. And in general, we can promote and foster better conditions of living for humankind, and promote social equality as well as people's well-being. So, by doing this, by thinking about this, we face several challenges, of course. I'm ready now. Sorry. Some challenges. How can we do to obtain a radiograph of urban complexity? The city is our life with so many variables. We have seen how some items within human development relate to this. We have seen the happiness index and all this in Denmark, with the example in Denmark. But how can this serve in a practical dialogue where scientists help us developing the tools and instruments, but where we are able to work with this with a practical language that allows us to identify the priorities and strategies that will foster such urban prosperity. A tool that will help us identifying the priorities as a practical instrument that will translate into well-being with a measurable matrix. I hope I can learn a lot from this event, but most of anything, this needs to be actionable. It is is not only that, oh, that's so good, or oh, that's so bad. No, something that sets the path for us towards what we need to do in order to transform our cities and transform life the way we know it. How to measure this efficiency, and of course, how to measure the effect that such actions from public policies can act, as well as accountability. So UN Habitat, at UN Habitat we have developed this initiative for prosperous cities, and this is public policy strategy that is oriented to finding collective well-being and happiness, we could say, through a set of variables that will allow us to understand our reality, taking as the core the people's needs. This is a tool that will help cities by setting the path to a prosperous a future that will allow them to measure and that will enable the decision-making process to identify opportunities. We have no time to wait. We have no time to wait for London to be constructed on a monthly basis. So for the year 2020, we are able to live all in more or less decent cities. We have to act today, and we have to act quickly, but we have to be sensitive enough and think in the long term. We have asked mayors in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in the US, in Canada, everywhere we have questioned mayors. Tell me, Miss Mayor or Mr. Mayor, tell me about the 5 most important elements, according to your opinion, to achieve prosperity within your city. And as a very funny piece of information, in small towns in Africa, the largest cities in Latin America, the very big cities in Shanghai or Copenhagen, that is a city big to Denmark, and Vancouver, for example, they have, the mayors of this city, they have expressed more or less the same thing: productivity, infrastructure, quality of life, equality, environmental sustainability, and urban governance. So they said, if as a mayor I can approach subjects with efficiency, we're going to be able to attain prosperity. And from this analysis on, we have invented what we have called the wheel of urban prosperity, by taking as a starting point these 5 or 6 variables that will allow us to understand cities. And we also asked mayors to tell us in more detail what they understand by productivity, infrastructure, quality of life, social equality and inclusion, environmental sustainability and governance. They have not said this, and then we have a definition. And I am not so able to get into detail due to time-related issues now, but this allowed us to have a common language amongst cultures, amongst borders, and through the different national scales to reach a common language in this sense. And by this, how we were able to develop a set of indicators that are very simple, very practical, very pragmatic, that set the basis for the construction of such a tool or instrument. This is an instrument that we have called Urban Prosperity Index. It is being implemented in a large set of countries, and many more countries are adding to it on a daily basis. They have 3 levels. It has 3 levels. A basic level that will allow us to make a global comparison between Guadalajara, or between Guadalajara and Toluca, and some other city like Tequila that I visited yesterday, Tequila town, very beautiful, and other cities in Africa, Asia, Europe, that will allow us how we are doing in terms of urban prosperity. We have an extended level that allows us to compare countries. In Mexico, next year, we are initiating a basic work, at least for 130 cities in Mexico, to create the baseline for understanding and analyzing what's the level of prosperity at the different cities. And we have a 3rd level, which is the contextual, and it refers to using, or where we can use this instrument as a measuring instrument that will evaluate the impact of public policies in time within a specific city. And we have been working with at some cities here in Mexico, at Guadalajara, Zapopan, Cajeme, and Corregidora, and we have our first experiences on how to do this in Mexico. The Prosperity Cities Index, how do we see it? Visually, we have obtained this diagram, and it shows the 6 variables: governance, infrastructure, quality of life, equality, environmental sustainability, and how the cities are doing. And it provides profiles. But this is a product that comes from the sub-indexes. And by the corner, we can see urban governance, and we are able to see economic growth, infrastructure, quality of life, social quality and inclusion, and environmental sustainability. And from a reading by the beginning, we can see, well, we are doing wrong here, we are doing well here. This is a successful practice we might repeat in terms of gender inclusion or education within the cities, or what refers to infrastructure and householding supply. But they also allow us to establish a quick consensus on where we are doing badly or poorly. And around each sub-index, we have the breakdown, and the breakdown includes accurate actions that will allow urban key players to take action. And what can be done with this? For an urban leader or a key player, it can be the mayor, the councillor, the parties, social movements, business people who are concerned about the future of their cities. This index allows more of all to obtain a radiograph, to know what lays behind. And many of the variables that we obtain are hard data, but some other are pieces of information that are intangible. For example, the presence of green areas, having green areas, or the quality of the city and its infrastructure. So, as I said, they allow us to get acquainted and be able to set an actionable plan, and to translate this analysis into concrete actions to identify both practices and policies that are good, that can be repeated, so we cannot, or we should not wait to invent the wheel on every case. And it allows us to develop sustainable solutions that will allow us to identify training topics and a specific action, lines of action, and also it allows us to set a monitoring device for the activities we perform according to the objectives. Now, from the international perspective to UN Habitat, this instrument also works as a way to make comparisons between cities or among cities. We are just beginning with this. This instrument has just been implemented at some countries for less than a year. Ethiopia, Brazil, Mexico, Panama are the countries where we have apply this from our venues at the different capitals of these countries, and this has allowed us to understand differences. For example, here we have a comparison between Vienna, Mexico City, and Johannesburg, where we can see the very typical European profile, where there is homogeneity around all the elements that produce high level of prosperity in a city like Vienna. And we get to see Mexico City that is doing okay in certain topics, but other topics are critical. And we get to see Johannesburg at the same time. And this kind of analysis that is truly, truly passionate, and I'm almost finished, it has allowed us to understand how cities in the world can be grouped, and essentially we get to see that developed countries, The cities of developed countries are ranking number 1 and 2. We have 6 subdivisions when there is not strong integration of the 5 elements, or where there is in Europe, where they have high production and high levels of well. And we have the 3 and 4th groups, where we have Latin America with less coordination, imbalance in the different dimensions. Prosperity is not even for all the citizens. And we get to see that the regulatory framework is under consolidation, and there is a large set of recommendations coming out from this analysis. I cannot get into so much detail. If you are interested, of course, you can approach me and make me questions. But I just want to mention now that in Mexico next year, there was a map, a very beautiful map of Mexico should be appearing now on my screen. Oh, there it is. So these are the places where we are going to start with this exercise, at least at the basic level, and we hope we can find interest either by the state governments or private companies, municipalities, in order to establish a whole map, so municipalities rely on a practical instrument to orient their public policies implementation. This instrument is a UN habitat instrument that will allow us to analyze, plan, take action, and observe the effects that public policies have when achieving or when attaining to social well-being. Other instruments, I am sure I will know of them in this forum. And then we will know if this provokes happiness and if this generates the well-being that we are following and we are going to obtain through these instruments. Thank you all for your attention. Well, now, by this we conclude our first table, our first discussion table, or for this forum that we have been summoned to. And it is very much interesting what we heard from John Halliwell about this report on happiness that he showed us, where I would enhance willing governments willing to apply public policies in favor of people's well-being, and also the way to evaluate quality of life by Dr. Viking. Dr. Viking, he told us how it can be that in a city, in one single city, we can quantify the quality of life by creating policies that generate quality of life to people. From Rodolfo de la Torre, we heard about prudence, and I think it is very timely that he speaks to us about indicators of well-being. And we heard also Gonzalo Hernandez about trust, which is basic for all societies when we relate to trust. And justice, practicing justice. Here in Mexico now we know, or at least one part of Mexican population feel attacked now. And Dr. Vitrop about the city, he has told us the city is a center of prosperity and how complex they have become. So we thank you all for your presence at this first table. We thank Mr. Gomez Alvarez for having organized this gathering, and we hope you continue with the next work. Thank you.